Hello, everyone. My name is Prem and Chandrasekaran. Welcome to the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast. This is where we decode all of the buzzwords and deep dive into tech that is shaping our world. I'm joined today by Birgitta Böckeler, who is my co-host. Birgitta, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, everybody. I'm Birgitta. I'm a technical principal with Thoughtworks in Berlin, Germany.
And we also have two of our luminary guests today. We've got Valentina. Valentina, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I work as a tech lead at Thoughtworks Spain. I've actually been a consultant since I started working, and I was lucky enough to work with continuous deployment in many of my companies. So I would say, overexposed to this topic, and I'm also working on a book about it. And that's what I'm here to talk about today, because, I've spent a great deal of thought about continuous delivery and continuous deployment, and it's really fascinating. So, that's me.
And last but not the least, we've got Ken.
Yep, I'm Ken Mugrage. I'm in Seattle, Washington. I'm one of the hosts on the podcast, but playing the role of guest today. I was the product manager for a product we had called GoCD for quite a while, a continuous delivery tool. And I'm also one of the global organizers for DevOps Days. So I have some fairly strong feelings on this topic. So glad to be here.
Yeah, and maybe I can talk a little bit about how the idea for this podcast came about. So we're going to talk today about CD versus CD, so continuous delivery versus continuous deployment. And this came about because last year, I think early last year, we had a round of revisions and improvements for our Thoughtworks Sensible Default Practices, which is like a set of practices that we maintain inside of Thoughtworks. We're a software consultancy, right? So it's like a set of practices that we want our teams to use as the sensible default choices. And one of our sensible default practices has always been early and continuous deployment. That was always the title. So, and last year there was a huge discussion about if we should change that to continuous delivery. And so this is kind of like how this episode came about, because Valentina also has an upcoming book about continuous deployment. So we want to discuss that today. Like, what are those two things? Is one better than the other? Maybe we can start with those definitions. Maybe, Ken, do you want to start defining continuous delivery for us?
Sure. So I'm going to cheat, though. There was a book that came out actually entitled Continuous Delivery in 2010. And I'm going to use theirs. So if I look at continuousdelivery.com, which is a website that Jez Humble, one of the authors, put together, continuous delivery is the ability to get changes of all types, including new features, configuration changes, bug fixes, and experiments into production or into the hands of users safely and quickly in a sustainable way. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think the highlights are all types. So it's not just new code; it's experiments and bug fixes and changes and all that sort of stuff. And then it says into production or into the hands of users. I'm sure we'll get into the difference between deploy and release later in the podcast, but I think the important thing there is that into the hands of users. You can't know if a thing worked if no one is using it.
And I think we're all taking this for granted today, right? But I remember, I think back when this first came about, like I wasn't working for Thoughtworks yet, and one of my colleagues was coming back from a conference where there was one of these seminal talks about continuously delivering to production. And that was a time when most organizations, were happy when they did 3 releases a year, right? And so this was like revolutionary at the time to actually automatically, continuously deliver, right?
Yeah, there was, I'm going to mess up. It's John Allspaw and another person gave a talk.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Deploying 10 times a day at Flickr or something like that.
Right. That was the one. Yes.
And then if Legend has it correctly, Andrew Clay Schaefer tweeted out something. He used hashtag DevOps during that talk. And so it was kind of interesting that they both kind of started at the same time, literally from the same talk.
That's awesome. Valentina, you're writing the book on continuous deployment. So what are your thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, I am. So at least the way I define continuous deployment and how I think we mostly understand it within Thoughtworks is that it's basically an addition to continuous delivery. Actually, I was talking to Dave Farley, who wrote the continuous delivery book about it. And he said that the way he sees it is more of a specific implementation of continuous delivery. But let's say this detail aside, it does encompass everything that I think we know and love from continuous delivery. So the way that we want to make the system always production ready and to be able to deploy on demand at any given time for all types of changes. But it also has one small addition, which is basically not only every change needs to be deployable to production, but it has to be actually deployed to production once it goes through all of the quality gates and all of the pipeline. So this might seem like a very small addition to the concept of the automated pipeline, which is already quite pervasive everywhere. But what I found, especially working in my teams, is that it seems like a small difference, but actually it implies a lot of changes in the team's ways of working that I'm happy to elaborate on later. But yeah, this is essentially the difference between the two. So continuous delivery, at least more traditionally, stops, I would say, just before deployments to production, even though they should be all done on demand. Whereas continuous deployment also, let's say, enforces the deployment to production for every commit.
Nice. So here is a thing that has always confused a lot of people, and probably has been a source of confusion for me as well. So there is also this term that we use, continuous integration, right? Which is probably something that was used even earlier than continuous delivery and deployment. What's the difference? And we always keep saying CI/CD, almost as if they're synonymous, right? So what's the difference, or is there a difference?
So continuous integration predates continuous delivery as a term, at least by a good decade. And it's interesting because we do a thing called Thoughtworks Radar where we call out different techniques and so forth. And we actually put one called CI Theater, or Continuous Integration Theater, on hold a couple of years ago. Because a lot of people thought that if you install Jenkins, you have CI. And that's really not the case. It's not a product. Continuous integration is about continuously integrating the code. So I make a change, it gets committed to my mainline or trunk or whatever you want to call it. Like we actually were recording a podcast yesterday about pull requests and is that CI? And I'm not going to get in that debate here today, but it really is about continuously testing. Early on, when there's a product called Cruise Control that came out, I think it was 2001 or so, and Martin Fowler's blog describing continuous integration was about the same time. We were like testing the code constantly and being able to showcase it at the end of an iteration or a sprint, which meant like show it to a product owner. But it still wasn't in production. It wasn't in front of users. And so we were testing it constantly, making sure it worked in a production-like environment and all of those things, but we still weren't actually delivering it. It still might be a year or 18 months before a user touched it. And we found out that, hey, it turns out that they didn't want that kind of car. And meanwhile, we spent all of that time doing all of this automated testing that we never got any real feedback on. At ThoughtWorks, we had frankly, a go wrong, we call it, when something bad happens. Before I joined, so it's, I think 2006, where we were doing all the quote unquote right things. I know on an audio recording, people can't see air quotes if I do them. But then it went to deploy, and it was deploying onto a Solaris environment after being developed on a Windows environment, and it simply wouldn't start. And they had to spend a couple of years refactoring it. And that led to a white paper that led to the continuous delivery book. And so, yeah, very long story, but CI is about the automated testing. What I hated to see at the time, and then I'll turn it over to Valentina to get the more recent thing, is that people would add a step to the end. They'd literally add a simple step that said deploy and call it continuous delivery. And that's just not it. There's more there in that gap.
Yeah, I think I agree with pretty much everything you said. I would say my personal take on continuous integration is that I see it as more or less the first step in this concept that I think comes from XP of like doing things more often. So to me, continuous integration was always about, validating often that your changes would actually work with other people's changes. So again, don't want to get into the whole debate with trunk-based development, but that is certainly a good way to do it because, you're all committing on trunk. Therefore, you have no choice but to integrate and to do the right thing. then it's not only the integration, but also the automated testing part and the building an artifact part. And I see continuous delivery as a further step, a further building block put on top of continuous integration, where not only we integrate and run the automated tests as many times as we possibly can, but also we deploy to at least pre-production environments as many times as we possibly can. So yeah, I think maybe all the terms are going through some semantic diffusion and are being maybe confused with having a Jenkins installation ready to go. But I think that there's ways to do continuous integration and delivery and deployment wrong, even if you have a Jenkins installed. So it's good that we're clarifying them here.
So to quickly summarize my understanding, what you're saying is continuous integration is a prerequisite for continuous delivery and maybe continuous deployment as well.
I believe so. So I've also worked in teams that were claiming that they do, for example, continuous delivery, but also had very, very long feature branches. And they only claimed that they did continuous delivery because they had an automated pipeline that would deploy on demand. But I would kind of disagree with that statement because, yes, you can deploy on demand, but can you really when all of your code is tucked away in some very long feature branches? Because, if you need a certain version or a quick bug fix, suddenly you have to do some very complicated version control trickery in order to get the commits you need and validate them and make sure that they don't interfere with other work. So I would say that is not really having your code base in an always deployable state because you're not fulfilling this prerequisite of continuous integration.
And it's quite easy for the commits on the branch to not be theoretically deployable because you feel like you're in a safe environment on your branch, right? Before we go more into comparison, I just wanted to briefly drive one point home a little bit more. Maybe I think both of you have already hinted at it, but very common question we get is, but why do I even need to deploy that many times, right? I think, Ken, you were already hinting at it with the Solaris Windows kind of thing. And Valentina, you were talking about risks, right? But talk a bit more about why would I even deploy multiple times a day when I don't even have a new user feature available, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is, and it's funny because we mentioned that John Allspot talk. A lot of it is about mean time to recovery and fixing problems. So when you have issues, and I stress the word when there, not if, it's how much do you have to do to fix it? So if I can deploy into a production-like environment, so like that, in that case, it was Solaris or what have you. When that fails, if my previous deployment was an hour ago, then I have a smaller thing to look at. In the case of actually getting in the hands of users, if all of a sudden my sales plummet because I made the buy button transparent or something silly, I get faster feedback. It's really about the feedback loop. It's about knowing whether it be a system issue or a network issue or a user issue or a user experience issue. It's really about getting the fastest feedback you possibly can and having the smallest change set in between your last known good and your current issue.
Yeah, and by the way, this is one of the reasons why I like continuous deployment so much is that fast feedback. So that change you have to sort through. If you deployed it an hour ago or 1 day ago, yes, it is small. But imagine that with continuous deployment, that change consists only of one commit every single time instead of, say, 5 or 10 commits that have accumulated since, your weekly deployment o'clock that you had with your team. So it really, really shrinks that mean time to recover because it shrinks the amount of changes you need to sift through. And that way it reduces also the amount of time you need to spend debugging. But also, I think that deploying more frequently, it's obviously beneficial for the rest of the 4 key metrics, of which, of course, you mentioned one. But if we look at them, I believe they were deployment frequency, lead time, and mean time to restore we've talked about, and the change failure rate, of course.
But you mean just to clarify, you mean the DORA metrics, right? Like in Thoughtworks, we sometimes call them 4 key metrics. Other people, I think, know them as the DORA metrics, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the DORA metrics also known. I think there's a 5th one, but to be honest, I don't remember which one it was.
It's availability.
But yeah, if I can speak at least the other 3, obviously, while the deployment frequency is self-explanatory, I won't even go there. But with a with shorter windows in between deployments, of course, the lead time for changes is drastically reduced because, the overall time it takes for a commit to go from the developer's laptop into production that is just shrunk immensely from a situation where you deploy once a month or versus a situation where you deploy multiple times per day. So that enables you, of course, to experiment much more quickly and also debug much more quickly. In teams where I was doing continuous deployment, for example, it was not uncommon to deploy to production one single log line as a commit in order to understand a bit better what a part of the system was doing when perhaps we had some doubts about the existing observability. Also, something surprising was that it really decreased the change failure rate, which might seem counterintuitive because you think, oh, wait, if I deploy to production all the time, doesn't that kind of guarantee that things will go wrong really often? So the answer is actually the opposite, because the bad changes that you make don't really get bundled up with the good changes. So even if you have, say, 10 commits to deploy and 3 of them are bad and they contain a bug or some sort of regression, if you deploy with the narrowest possible granularity, then overall, even with the same 3 bad commits, you will have a lower rate of failures if you deploy more granularly. And of course, with all the benefits we already talked about and of easier time debugging, etc. So yeah, that was a surprising effect on all of the metrics that at least I saw.
So one question I have, and maybe this is a bit controversial, right? The criticism that I hear a lot of times is that, we are not Facebook. We don't want to, even if we are ready to be able to deploy, we don't really want to because our business users don't want that. What's the comeback there? Or if I really want to do continuous deployment, are there other things that I need to be able to do so that I can actually be ready for it? Because not everyone can pull this off.
Yeah, and that's why when we were talking about what the Thoughtworks sensible default should be, which again, if people didn't catch it, we use the term sensible defaults instead of something like best practice because there's no such thing as a best practice. That's why I was actually lobbying for continuous delivery over continuous deployment, was for that reason. So releasing software, making software available to users is a multifaceted thing. It's certainly the features of the software itself, but it also is quite often training of the users or training of support staff or a marketing event where we want to make a big splash, or there's other reasons why you might want to not deliver something constantly or not deploy something constantly. We were even joking before we started recording this call because when I went to start it, my Zoom client had to update because it had continuously deployed during the night. And so I was a couple of minutes late. And so the joke I always say is that, and part of this is me showing my age, admittedly, because of, packaged software and large software versus microservices and that sort of thing. Not ready to disclose my age, but I can tell you I worked for an ISP in 1991. So, what I would always tell people, like for a website, absolutely, or now microservices, different architectures. But if you give me a new version of Photoshop 10 times a day, I'm going to be very angry. And so it's part of that is the architecture question, I guess.
Yeah, the delivery mechanism. I mean, you're talking about a rich client here, right? And
exactly.
But there's also web applications and so on, right? So
yeah,
it's still that's the idea of the defaults, right? It doesn't mean you do them all the time. There are always reasons why, not always, but there are frequently reasons why you might, kind of like soften the default. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think one nuance that I would like to add here is what we were also mentioning before, which is the difference between a deployment and a release. So I completely agree with Ken that as a user, myself, I don't really want to have to deal with new features released multiple times a day because simply I would not be able to use any software at all. But I think that the continuous delivery already, but especially deployment, it forces you to introduce some mechanisms that separate the concept of deployment and release. And in particular here, I am referring to feature flags. So I believe that with this type of method, we can basically keep the difference between our code base and production as low as possible without necessarily releasing new features that are visible changes for the users to act on. And in fact, I would even go further to say that I believe deployments should be more technical events that are completely overseen by the engineering team, and they happen on the cadence and at the discretion of the engineering team, whereas product releases, so changing visible behavior, that needs to have A/B testing around it. It has to have a calendar because we don't want to release several features at the same time, polluting the data from our users' feedback and so on. So I would say that in things like web applications, this comes really easy when deployments are basically imperceptible to the end user. Of course, in the example of Photoshop, or even harder ones like mobile apps or, self-driving cars or smart toasters, deployment itself can be a disruptive event. So that is where we can have more nuance and say, maybe in those situations, continuous delivery is more appropriate than deployment. I think each one can have its own domains, essentially.
Yeah, and if I could flip sides onto Valentina's side of the debate here real quick, another thing about feature flags that is awesome is the ability, as we mentioned, is experiments. So using technologies like that, I can experiment. I can say, I want to roll out this or actually deploy this feature and then release this feature to a percentage of my audience and find out if it's effective before I go out to other ones. Microsoft calls it blast radius, but there's lots of things. So very much on Valentina's side here, where if you can continuously deploy and then use software features to release, absolutely should.
So what I'm hearing from both of you is that, one, Ken, you said that, if you're continuously deploying all the time, it's very annoying for users. And I can relate to that. I use a software called Home Assistant. It's open source software, which is home automation software. And they do releases every month. And it's very annoying sometimes. Like I just updated something and there's something new already there. And I'm like, I really don't know if I need it. But what you're saying, Valentina, is that you can simulate continuous delivery through the use of feature flags, and thereby also get the best of both worlds, where you get really, really good at deploying and thereby, get that change failure rate down, but then at the same time, not affect how end users perceive what you've been doing, to control the amount of change that they see, right? If you want to do it that way.
Exactly. And the fact that you have feature flags and you do have the code in a production environment, I would even add it has some more benefits than simply keeping the code locked in pre-production waiting for a monthly release. So one of those benefits, for example, to me is when you can, of course, feature flags allow you to test directly in the production environment by enabling certain users to see the feature or not. And I would say that where we can do this, and again, web applications are one of the prime examples, this is an extremely powerful feature. And it, of course, the more often you deploy, the more you can leverage it, because it means that stakeholders, so your PO, anyone who's interested in the feature, your QA engineers in the team, they can prove that this feature works in production. And that gives you such a high level of confidence when you really want to enable it for an A/B test or for a gradual rollout, that it's basically almost impossible to see regressions afterwards, because all of those differences that we sometimes see between staging and production have been canceled. So data differences, network configuration differences, they are not a factor anymore. And you can really do all of the manual exploratory testing needed in the most prod-like environment of all, which is production, obviously. So yeah, lots of power there.
To be clear, though, feature toggles are used in both continuous delivery and continuous deployment, or even more so, are needed for both continuous delivery and deployment, right? Because also for continuous delivery, when you want deployment to be a business decision, you have to have every state of your software to be theoretically deployable. So you also need feature toggles, right? Yeah. So if we go a little bit more into the comparison, maybe I was mentioning that big discussion, internal discussion that we had before, what should be the default, right? And one of the things was kind of like about aspiration and complexity, the points that people were making. So, for example, the proponents of changing the default, our internal default to continuous delivery said, isn't saying continuous deployment is the default distracting from the bigger picture and maybe like kind of distracting people because they have to be more aspirational, think about more things, and isn't, being able to deploy on demand good enough as the ultimate goal.
Yeah, and this is where we always say if you put 4 thought workers in a room, you'll get 5 opinions or 5 definitions and so forth. Is like we did an infographic a few years ago that said the difference between continuous delivery and continuous deployment, and there was a finger hitting a button on the second one. In an ideal world, to me, the technical of what you do and how ready you are and how prepared you are and is your documentation done is exactly the same. And the only difference is that I have said, hey, for whatever reasons, for our go-to-market or whatever, maybe we're a regulated industry, that Prem has to push a button to make it happen. Prem pushing that button runs exactly the same step as a continuous deployment pipeline would have. And so to me, the testing is exactly the same. The automation is exactly the same. The only difference is, does the pipeline fire off that step manually or automatically? And I know that not everybody shares that vision. They think there's a difference in the testing level or the readiness level, which I'll let Valentina talk about there. But if they are the same, then to me, it wasn't aspirational, really. It's the same pipeline. You just choose whether or not you're going to push the button.
I see that point of view, but I would say there is a few differences that I see between continuous delivery and deployment in terms of workflow. So I agree that the quality gates should mostly be the same because always, of course, we always need the observability and automated tests, both at unit level and at higher levels of abstraction and in real environments and so on. But fundamentally, what I see is that when you remove that button with the finger on it that lets your changes go to production, at least in my experience, some interesting things have happened in my teams, which is one of the reasons I started writing about it. And that's where I think the interest lies with continuous deployment. And the first difference was, first, there was a bit of a sense of paralysis because suddenly there was no more distinction between defining a change that should happen to the code base at some point in time and applying that change. So the act of developing was becoming simultaneous with production deployments. And this had some interesting consequences when we were working on distributed systems, which is the case for most non-trivial systems, of course. So as just an example, what happened to us was that before, when we had the gates to production, we would deploy weekly. And in one of our teams, this meant deploying all of our systems at the same time, essentially. Suddenly, however, without the gate to production, one day we had to basically refactor one feature across 2 systems. And that impacted the contract between those 2 systems, changing a field type. I'm overly simplifying here. But we found ourselves in the situation where we made all the changes locally that we could think of, and the code base was absolutely perfect in both components. Yet we could not find a way to deploy it with continuous deployment because whichever one we deployed first would immediately break the other. And so we realized that we were relying on simultaneous deployments and ordering of deployments when we did have a gate to production because we did have that manual button. And this changed things.
It surfaced a weakness of your existing system that you couldn't see when you had more manual control over it.
Exactly. So manual control used to give us some measures to, for example, change the ordering of deployments or trigger them whenever we wanted, that now we had lost. And so we had to make up for it with better safeguards at the code level. So, for example, never releasing software versions that were not compatible with version n-1 of another component and so on. So this is just one of the impacts that it had on our workflow. Other ones are, for example, where we did our testing, suddenly our staging environments were becoming a little bit useless. And also what the different phases of our workflow meant. One example of this is we used to map the columns on our board to specific environments. So if something was in QA, meant was deployed in pre-production. If something was in done, meant it was waiting for deployment to production. But suddenly, all of our tasks in the progress column were already in production itself. So what were our QA engineers going to do, and where were they going to test? And so we had to reshuffle a lot of things just as a consequence of removing that very innocent looking deploy button. And yeah, so it did end up becoming very interesting. And these topics came up over and over in all the teams where I used it.
And I think some people might say, oh, yeah, so you had extra effort because you started doing continuous deployment, right? You wouldn't have needed to do this in continuous delivery. But I think there's all of this like effort that isn't being looked at before, that is all about cognitive load, right? And like cognitive complexity of keeping all of this in mind. Okay, you first have to deploy this, and then we do this, and then we have to coordinate, and we have to go on a call. And that's like, and you have to do that every single time you have this situation, as opposed to doing an automation of, and improving this setup so it becomes more resilient, right?
I would say the effort doesn't disappear or doesn't increase, it just moves. So whereas that cognitive load with continuous delivery, it could be before you deploy your code from pre-production to production, continuous deployment kind of forces you to shift it during the development phase. And I would argue that that is a great place for that cognitive load to be. So thinking of task coverage, security, interdependencies between systems that you're deploying. This is the whole theme of shifting quality to the left for me. I think there is no more left than the development phase itself. And that's where you can have the most context and collaboration on those changes. So yeah, I would also say that it kind of removes the temptation to cheat at continuous delivery because it kind of makes it impossible.
And so again, back to our discussion. So something that somebody said who was against changing the default from deployment to delivery said, if we change this to continuous delivery, is that sending a message to people in Thoughtworks that we think continuous deployment is more extreme? It's more of an exception. And there were actually quite a few people chiming in about like multiple experiences also at large enterprises where continuous deployment is the default, right? So how fringe is this, Valentina? How many companies are actually doing this? Is it extreme?
I would say there's a large amount of companies that I found, because I know this because I had to collect case studies for the book. And it's one of those practices where there's a certain bubble of companies doing it without any problem and really enjoying it and just seeing absolutely no issue with continuous deployment. And then there's a large amount of companies also outside of the bubble who thinks it's absolutely crazy to deploy every commit to production, which is one of the reasons I collected case studies in the first place, to show that, hey, this is being done and yes, it's happening. Just for context, of course, we don't really have data on continuous deployment itself because studies like the State of DevOps study only specifically look at continuous delivery, which is a more broad term. And so I don't have exact figures, but I can tell you in my experience working with companies that I would say maybe we're spanning 5 countries. And, I'm relatively young in my career still. I still found a dozen or so just working as an individual developer consultant within 2 consultancy companies. So I would say perhaps it's more common than a lot of people think.
I have a 2-part question for both of you, actually. So imagine I'm an upcoming startup. What should I do? Should I aspire for continuous delivery? Should I go for continuous deployment? And then the second part of the question is, let's say I'm an established business and I've got a bunch of users already, and maybe I'm doing neither. What should I be trying to do? I mean, should I just go for the ultimate continuous deployment, or should I say, okay, I'll start with continuous delivery? What's your advice for both sets of teams?
Well, so the correct consultant answer is it depends. And we have to make that joke in every podcast. In your first example, where it's a new thing, I mean continuous deployment, because why would I create a thick client that has to be downloaded in 2024? It's going to be a cloud-based app, whether it be public or private is neither here nor there. It's going to be a distributed system. And by the way, distributed doesn't mean continents. It can mean Kubernetes clusters, and so I think continuous deployment is absolutely the way to go for any new application, using the difference between deploy and release that Valentina talked about earlier. So then you have to look at, okay, what is my, I don't know what the right word is, appetite for changes among my users and so forth. And you have to decide whether or not you want to roll out new features all the time. But as far as deploying to production, that should be any greenfield. And then your second one is, I'm going to pretend, even if you didn't mean it to be, that it was a bit of a trick question, because if they have neither, then they probably don't have good automated testing and so forth. And so I'm going to say that what they probably are hurting at the most is continuous integration, and that they need to worry about testing and so forth. I think it was Kent Beck that was saying something like, I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember the quote, but it was basically, the first step is making it easy to change. The second step is actually changing. And so my guess is for most legacy stuff that you need to work on the automation as well as the test, as far as the testing and that sort of thing goes, and the ability to make quick changes and the ability to either deploy or deliver on demand. It's very unlikely they're ready for either CD. My guess is that you really have to go back deeper than that.
I would agree. And if I could offer like an ordering for at least the second scenario, I would definitely look at continuous integration first with all of the test coverage that comes with it. So agreeing with you there. Then moving on to automated deployments on demand with continuous delivery. And then if and only if all the quality gates are top notch, maybe moving to continuous deployment if it applies to the type of company. Of course, we discussed several domains, several types of applications where that is not feasible. Going back to the Photoshop example, I would say that I would recommend continuous deployment only to companies, regardless of their maturity, if they have full control of their production environment. And that production environment is not, for example, in the user's hands, like a mobile phone or, a desktop application. So
I think I'd also like to add, I was actually at a conference yesterday, and Nathan Harvey, who runs the current DORA project at Google, was there. And somebody was asking about some of the metrics and so forth. And it was specifically in a legacy type question. And he made the point, and I really, really liked it. That he would rather see 20% improvement for a team than the highest scoring team on the metrics, if you will. And so, if you're in that second situation that Prem mentioned, getting better is the next step, right? So maybe it doesn't even make sense for you to try to get to I'm going to deploy to my users every month, and if you're at a year and a half now. The point is incremental improvement and getting into the hands of users faster, getting faster feedback, reacting to market changes and political changes and economic changes and et cetera. So don't feel like it's an all or nothing. Getting better is a great next step.
Maybe I can round it up by actually saying like what we decided for the Thoughtworks sensible default practices, because I think it's a great example of the it depends problem and how ultimately it's really all about the context, right? Because these default practices in Thoughtworks are for a consulting company, they're not for a particular client, right? So we kind of also went back to why do we have these in the first place, and it's one of our artifacts of our communities of practice, and it's also about like showing people like what skills they should actually develop, what they should be able to speak about articulately, what they with our clients, right? And also they're about like us having an aspiration to continuously impact the craft and influence the industry as well. So that's why we actually kept it at early and continuous deployment, to say this is the best thing that kind of helps us grow and advance the practice. And also for me as the community lead at the time, it's actually something that then people continuously start discussions about and actually like have discussions and engage and actually learn from each other, right? So that was the why behind them in my particular case, which is potentially different than from an organization who wants to set a default for their new teams, right? And it can also be in some teams it makes sense, in other teams it doesn't. And, so as always, like we have to think about the why in our context and not just about exactly what's in a book, right?
Thanks a lot, Valentina and Ken. I mean, this was really fun, So what we seem to be saying is that continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment, all three of them are worthy things to take up. So what you will choose to do eventually in your context will depend on a lot of things that are realities for you. But the bias thing is to go for continuous deployment and make it appear as if you're doing continuous delivery through the use of things like toggles and so on and so forth. But that's me. Your realities might be very different.
And I'm looking forward to reading your book, Valentina. Do you have like a target date when it's coming out?
Yeah, actually, it's already available on Amazon for pre-order. I don't remember if the target date is August or October. I'm a bit ashamed of it because that's something I should know. But you can definitely pre-order it, and there's a preview online on the Early Learning platform. So if you have access to that already, or you want to do a free trial, you can already find there an early release version, which is not edited yet, and the figures haven't been redrawn, but you can still read it.
Well, looking forward to it.
And thanks a lot, folks. It was really fun. And we look forward to the next episode.